welcome to the debate. Today, we are actually staring at the wall. Or, more accurately, we're staring at what hangs on the wall in almost every government office, school, and police station across Nigeria. We are looking at the map.
Right.
To most of us, it's just a shape, a recognizable outline of the nation that we've seen since kindergarten. But we're here to discuss a claim that suggests this shape is not just a drawing, but a lie.
And not just a lie, but a calculated political weapon. That is the accusation we are unpacking today. It is a claim that takes something as mundane as cartography, literally lines on paper, and turns it into a massive conspiracy.
Exactly. We are dissecting the arguments of Raj Blaskia, a critic who has put forward a genuinely fiery thesis. He argues that the current map of Nigeria is a political gerrymander. He claims it is logically incorrect. He calls it foolish, and most provocatively, that it violates the fundamental rules of cardinal points by making the North appear significantly larger than the South.
It is a really fascinating collision of geometry and grievance. Because on one side, you have the established science of geodesy and coordinate systems, and on the other, you have Blaskia's assertion that the map is an insult to logic itself. The core question we are wrestling with is this: is the map of Nigeria a tool of oppression that defies the laws of direction, or is it a neutral reflection of the Earth's surface?
I'll be taking the side of Raj Blaskia today. I will argue that the map creates a false reality, that it intentionally stretches the North to disadvantage the South, and that the silence of the academic community on this issue is not scientific consensus, but complicity.
And I will defend the map, not as a political symbol, but as a scientific document based on latitude, longitude, and the objective rotation of the Earth. I'll argue that cardinal points are for navigation, not for ensuring that every region gets an equal share of the paper.
Well, let's start where Blaskia starts, which is with the visceral reaction, because this isn't dry academic criticism. When Blaskia looks at the map of Nigeria, he describes a deep sense of betrayal. He says it explicitly troubles his sensibility. He looks at the way the northern region sprawls across the top of the paper, dwarfing the South, and he gets angry. He calls it foolish.
It is a strong emotional response to a geometric shape. But we have to ask, is that emotion based on a misunderstanding of what a map actually is? Or, is he seeing something we've just been trained to ignore?
Blaskia would say the misunderstanding lies with us, the public, who have just blindly accepted a distortion. He argues that this visual dominance of the North is a political gerrymander. He believes the map violates the territorial integrity of the country, not by changing borders on the actual ground, but by warping the representation of them to create a psychological hierarchy. If the North looks bigger, the North feels more powerful.
I don't deny that maps have psychological power. A big shape looks more important than a small shape, sure. But Blaskia goes a step further. He claims there is a conspiracy of silence. He asks, why has no sensible person ever challenged it? He explicitly accuses geographers and professors of being afraid to offend the powers that be. He thinks they are maintaining a visual lie to prop up a specific political order.
And can you really blame him for that suspicion? If you grow up seeing your region compressed and the other region expanded and no one ever explains why, it looks like a setup. He calls it a violation of the rule of the cardinal point. To him, the logic of the compass demands balance, and the map provides inequality.
That phrase, the rule of the cardinal point, that is where we really have to drive in the first stake. Blaskia builds his entire castle on this foundation, but we need to rigorously examine if that foundation actually exists in science.
Well, the source material is quite specific. Cardinal points are the main points of the compass: north, south, east, west. We agree on that, right?
Precisely. They are directions. In navigation and geodesy, these are called azimuths. North is 0 degrees or 360, depending on how you look at the circle. East is 90, south is 180, and west is 270. They are navigational aids relative to the poles. The mnemonic we all learned, never eat soggy waffles. It's about orientation. It tells you which way to turn your body or your ship.
Right. But I think you were stripping the meaning away from the words. There is an implied logic to those directions. They are symmetrical. North is the direct opposite of south. East opposes west. Blaskia's argument is that this symmetry should be reflected in the territory. If you have a north, you must have a balancing south. It's a binary system.
But that is a category error. That is like saying, because left and right are opposites, my left hand must be the exact same size as my right hand, or that the road to the left must be as long as the road to the right. Cardinal points tell you where things are, not how big things are. Blaskia seems to be treating the north and the south not as directions, but as containers that must hold equal volume.
But visually, structurally, if the map is drawn based on these points, why does the north dominate the visual space so aggressively?
Blaskia says the map beats his imagination. He looks at the compass rose, sees the balance, looks at the map, sees the imbalance, and concludes the system is lying. He believes the north has been explicitly stretched to occupy southern regions. Stretched is the key word there. That implies an active distortion by a cartographer, a hand physically pulling the lines like rubber to cheat the South out of space. But we have to look at how a map is actually constructed. We don't just draw lines based on feelings or political desires. We use the graticule, the grid of latitude and longitude.
Which Blaskia dismisses as part of the system that lies. He implies that hiding behind the math is exactly how the lie is perpetuated.
He can dismiss it, but he cannot navigate without it. Let's break this down because this is the crucial insight. Latitude measures how far north or south you are from the equator. Longitude measures how far east or west you are from the prime meridian. These aren't political opinions. They're angular measurements from the center of the Earth.
Okay, but apply that to the specific shape of Nigeria. Why does that math result in the shape Blaskia hates?
Gladly. Nigeria sits roughly between 4 degrees and 14 degrees north latitude. That is a span of about 10 degrees. But look at the width. The country is physically wider at the top, in the north, than it is at the bottom. The northern border stretches across a wider longitude than the coastal south. When you plot those coordinates, literally just putting a dot where the math tells you to, you get a shape where the north is larger.
But you are assuming those coordinates are neutral.
They are.
No. Blaskia argues that cardinal points are subjective in their application. This is a profound philosophical point. He's suggesting that the definitions themselves have been manipulated or applied selectively.
There is a grain of truth in the history of mapping, but Blaskia takes it in the wrong direction. The prime meridian, the line that defines east and west, is absolutely subjective. It was chosen in 1884 at a conference in Washington, D.C. to run through Greenwich, England. Why? Because the British had the biggest navy and the most shipping. It could have been Paris. It could have been Timbuktu. It was a political choice.
Exactly. This is Blaskia's point. If the starting line of the entire grid was a political decision by a colonial power, why is it so hard to believe that the internal map of Nigeria is also a political decision? If the British could decide where zero is, couldn't they, or the subsequent Nigerian governments, decide to stretch the north to maintain control?
You have to distinguish between the origin of the system and the application of the system. Yes, the zero line is arbitrary, but once you set that line, the math relative to it is objective. And more importantly, the equator, which defines north and south, is not political. It is physics. It is the midline of the Earth's rotation. You cannot gerrymander the equator without stopping the rotation of the planet.
But Blaskia isn't arguing against the rotation of the Earth. He is arguing against the representation of the land on the paper. He believes that scientific evidence can prove the map is unnecessarily wrong. He sees the visual disparity, the massive north versus the compressed south, as a violation of the rule of balance. You keep talking about the grid, but he is talking about the visual impact.
But the visual impact is a direct result of the grid. If I weigh 200 pounds and you weigh 150 pounds and we step on a scale, the scale isn't biased because it shows a higher number for me. The scale is just reporting the mass. The map is just reporting the surface area. Nigeria has a landmass where the northern region, geographically, physically, occupies more square kilometers than the southern region. To draw them as equal size to satisfy a sense of fairness would be the lie. That would be the actual distortion.
I think you are missing the nuance of his conspiracy argument. It's not just about the lines, it's about the silence. He is incredibly critical of the academic community. He says, "It is a shame that none of the so-called academicians in the country ever pointed this out." He theorizes that they are benefiting from the government of the day.
That is a serious charge. He is accusing every geography professor in Nigeria of professional malpractice or corruption.
Or fear. He suggests they are afraid to offend the powers that be. In a country where regional politics are incredibly tense, challenging the visual dominance of the North could be seen as a subversive act. Blaskia is positioning himself as the brave outlier who is willing to say, the emperor has no clothes, or in this case, the map has no logic.
I think there is a simpler explanation for the silence of the academics. They aren't speaking up because there is nothing to correct.
That sounds quite dismissive.
It's not meant to be. It's about professional literacy. A geographer knows that a meridian is an imaginary line connecting the poles. They know that land borders are historical accidents, treaties, and results of wars. They are not geometric shapes designed to be symmetrical. There is a concept in anatomy called the sagittal plane, which divides the body into equal right and left halves. Blaskia seems to want the map of Nigeria to be like a sagittal plane perfectly balanced. But a country isn't a body. It's a jagged piece of land.
But doesn't that jagged piece of land shape our reality? If the map makes the North look like a giant that is swallowing the South, that creates a political reality. Blaskia says the map looks foolish. He implies that it makes the observer feel small. By hiding behind coordinates, are we ignoring the fact that this image is used to reinforce Northern dominance?
We can discuss whether the map is used for propaganda, sure. But Blaskia's claim is that the map is a gerrymander, that it was drawn incorrectly. Those are two fundamentally different things. If I take a photo of you and you are tall, the photo isn't biased for showing you as tall. If I use that photo to say tall people are better, that's politics. But the photo itself is just light hitting a sensor. The map is just data hitting a grid.
But is the data neutral? Blaskia argues that cardinal points are subjective in their application. We choose how to frame the world. We put north at the top. That's a choice. We could put south at the top.
That is true. North-up orientation is a convention, largely popularized by Mercator and European navigators. We could have south-up maps. But, and this is crucial, even if you flip the map upside down, the northern region of Nigeria, which would now be at the bottom, would still be larger than the southern region. The orientation doesn't change the surface area.
Unless the projection itself is the lie. We know map projections distort size. The Mercator projection famously makes Greenland look as big as Africa. Could Blaskia be sensing a projection error?
That is a generous interpretation, but Nigeria is very close to the equator. The distortion in most standard projections is minimal there. It's not like plotting Antarctica. The stretching he perceives is simply the reality of the Sahel versus the coast. The north is vast, open territory. The south is coastal and compacted.
So you are basically saying his eyes are lying to him?
I am saying his eyes are seeing size, but his brain is interpreting it as injustice. He is looking for a symmetry that nature never promised. He says the map violates the territorial integrity of Nigeria. I would argue that acknowledging the actual shape of the country is respecting its integrity. Pretending it is a perfect square or a balanced circle would be the fantasy.
And yet, the fantasy might feel more true to his sense of fairness. This brings us back to the role of the experts. If Blaskia is wrong, why hasn't a geographer simply explained this to him? Why the conspiracy of silence?
Perhaps because the argument falls so far outside the realm of standard geography that it is difficult to engage with. It's like a musician arguing that a bridge is built wrong because it doesn't sound like a C major chord. The engineer doesn't know how to respond because the bridge isn't supposed to be a song. The map isn't supposed to be a balance scale.
That effectively shuts down the conversation, though. It says you don't have the degree, so your perception doesn't matter. But Blaskia speaks for the common observer. He says the map is incorrect and misleading. If the average person looks at it and feels misled, isn't that a failure of cartography?
That is a fair point. If a map is a tool for communication and it communicates oppression to the viewer, then maybe we need better education on how to read maps. We need to explain that north is just a direction, not a hierarchy. We need to explain that landmass size does not equal political value.
But Blaskia would say that's naive. In politics, size is value, territory is power. By codifying this specific shape, the system, as he calls it, permanently enshrines that power imbalance. He says scientific evidence can prove it is unnecessarily wrong. He is calling for a sensible person to challenge it.
And I suppose today we are those sensible people testing that challenge. But the scientific evidence leads us back to the coordinates. We use the World Geodetic System now, WGS 84. It uses satellites. It treats the Earth as a spheroid. It is incredibly precise. Unless Blaskia implies the satellites are also part of the conspiracy.
In a world of deep fakes and data manipulation, is that so hard to imagine? But let's look at his conclusion. He wants a map that respects the rule of the cardinal point. If we humor him, what would that look like?
It would look like an abstraction, a piece of modern art. You would have to shrink the north or stretch the south artificially. You would destroy the navigational utility of the map. You couldn't use it to build a road or fly a plane. It would cease to be a map and become a political cartoon.
Maybe that's what he thinks the current map already is, a political cartoon drawn by history to mock the South. He sees the stretching as a deliberate act of the pen, not the satellite.
That is a poetic way to put it, even if I entirely disagree with the premise.
Let's consider the concept of territorial integrity he raises again. Lazakia argues that the map fails this test. Usually, territorial integrity means protecting borders from invasion, but he uses it to mean protecting the borders from internal distortion. It's a novel use of the term.
It is. He's arguing for representational integrity. But again, true integrity comes from truth. The truth is, the North is roughly 2/3 of the landmass. If you change that on the map, you are lying about the territory. You are sacrificing the integrity of the land for the integrity of the feeling.
But feelings drive nations, don't they? If a large portion of the population looks at the map and sees a lie, that matters. Blasnakia is channeling a very real frustration. He talks about how it troubles his sensibility. That's not math, that's soul. He feels diminished by the cartography.
And I empathize with that. I really do. But we cannot let our feelings dictate our facts. If we start redrawing maps to make everyone feel equal, we lose the ability to understand our world. We stop navigating reality and start navigating our own desires.
I think that's the crux of the disagreement right there. Blasnakia sees the map as a flexible tool of the state, one that should reflect justice. You see it as a rigid tool of science, one that must reflect coordinates. He sees a gerrymander, you see a grid.
I see a grid that doesn't care about politics. The equator doesn't care who is president. The prime meridian, arbitrary as it is, doesn't care about regional zones. The map is indifferent, and maybe that indifference is what feels like oppression.
Indifference can certainly feel like oppression when you are on the smaller side of the line.
Fair enough, but I will stick to my compass. North is north, south is south, and the size of the land is what the land is.
Well, we are reaching the end of our time, and the divide remains deep. For Raj Blaskia, the map is a document of betrayal. It violates his sensibility because it elevates the North over the South, defying the intuitive balance of the compass. He sees a foolish distortion and a conspiracy of experts who refuse to speak the truth about this visual gerrymandering. He wants us to reject the system that lies in that map.
Never eat soggy waffles helps us find our way. It doesn't promise us equal portions of waffles. The map reflects the objective reality of the grid, latitude and longitude, even if the history that drew the borders was messy and unequal.
It is a powerful reminder that we don't just see with our eyes, we see with our history, our politics, and our emotions. A map is never just a map.
Indeed. Sometimes the hardest terrain to navigate is the gap between how the world looks to us and how it is actually measured.
We will leave you to look at the map of Nigeria again. Does it look like a lie, or does it look like the land? That is for you to decide.
Until next time.
Goodbye.